Gauteng's new Premier has revealed her action plan for the province, and in what would be a very controversial move, Nomvula Mokonyane wants to formalise prostitution in Gauteng, as well as tackle crime and poverty.
It's the world's oldest profession. Sex for sale on the streets of Gauteng and just about everywhere else in the country. But it's still illegal. For years, sex workers have been fighting for rights and recognition. And they might have just solicited an ally in Gauteng's first female premier, Nomvula Mokonyane.
What I think is more progressive is the recognition of commercial sex work, which is different from legalizing. Let's recognize that is there, have a designated area, register people, let them be subjected to periodic health tests, and also let them be subjected to what me and you are subjected to, tax and all those kind of things.
But the new Premier's plans extend beyond those for just the ladies of the night. She wants to reduce violent crime by 7 to 10%. A tough task in a province where at least 10 people are killed every day.
For too long, Gauteng has been perceived as a gangster's paradise. We want to challenge all that. We are going to improve the image of the province.
The Premier's team will also have to work hard to ensure Gauteng remains the economic hub of Africa. Unemployment has risen to over 21% in this province. Add to that a continuous influx of job seekers, and Team Gauteng has suddenly got a mammoth challenge on its hands, keeping the country's financial hub thriving amid a global economic slowdown. And it all needs to start by turning pre-election promises into action. Vanessa Govender, E-News, Johannesburg.
Well, joining us now is Eric Harper. He's with the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force, SWET. Eric, thanks for coming in. You must be very pleased to hear statements like that, especially coming from a Premier.
We were immensely pleased. After years and years of sex workers being subjected to human rights violations and not having their rights recognized, at last we have a voice of rationality, and we also have compassion. We have compassion in that if you've experienced human rights violations, it goes an immense way when somebody actually acknowledges you as a human being and recognizes you. And secondly, we are tired of criminals capitalizing upon sex workers in an environment where sex work is illegal, and this goes a long way to addressing that.
The Gauteng Premier's comments coming barely 24 hours after a pretty favourable report on legalising prostitution from the Law Commission.
Yes, at last the Law Reform Commission has released a discussion paper on the different models one can use to address sex work, and it's going to be up for debate. And obviously we are advocating for decriminalisation because we argue that in a decriminalised environment you have a better way of addressing what the Premier was talking about, people who capitalise upon sex workers, the criminals. And there's also a way of actually then sex workers can come forward and report cases like trafficking and other cases of exploitation. It's also a better way of accessing and so providing health care. And it's also a way of granting human recognition. And it's had immense success actually in New Zealand, which has actually used that model, and they've had a reduction in crime.
How do you see a legalised prostitution industry working?
Well, we need to make a distinction between legalised and decriminalised. The Premier is arguing for legalised. We're arguing for decriminalised. What we're arguing is that the commonality in the two positions is that there's regulation. But what we're arguing is that the same laws that apply to any citizen like yourself or me should apply to sex workers, so that sex workers pay taxes, that they're subjected to the same working conditions as anybody else.
Are we talking about a red light district in places like Johannesburg?
That's what the Premier is talking about. Our position would be that we should just use the same laws that apply to everybody else, and that the illegality of sex work falls away. But we really welcome the fact that the Premier has opened up this debate and the Law Reform Commission, and that people clearly see that there's a need for change.
I'm glad you raised the word debate, because you must be kidding yourselves if you don't think there's going to be one. And there's a lot of people in this country who think this is a really, really bad idea. What do you say to them?
We welcome different opinions, but I think the trouble is that people actually reduce the debate to either or terms, and we don't get very far when it's reduced to either all bad or all good. So people need to start thinking about the complexities of the sex work debate. Sex work is immensely complicated. It brings to the surface a whole host of issues that society is grappling with. Issues around lack of education, issues around violence against women, issues around discrimination against the LGBT community. issues around poverty. The vast majority of sex workers in South Africa and in Africa enter the industry due to factors around poverty. And yes, there are sex workers that exploit other sex workers, and it's not a rosy situation. But there are also sex workers who are deeply disturbed by the criminality that goes on and would actually like to be involved in neighborhood watch schemes. So let's embrace the complexity. Let's think about the complexity as opposed to have some knee-jerk moral reaction. Because then you're the state in a moral position and you're not thinking about what's going on. And you can continually put your head in the sand, but it's going to be here. It's going to remain. And at the moment, it's just a window of opportunity for criminals. And the Premier is absolutely correct. We've got to do something to address that.
Give us some idea of the size of the industry we're talking about. I mean, how many people is your task force representing?
The industry is very big. We did a survey in Cape Town, an extensive mapping survey, and in Cape Town alone there's over 1,000 sex workers, and our estimates were probably conservative. In Johannesburg the numbers are far larger. In places in other African countries, for example, in Nigeria, they're estimating something like 300,000. In Kenya, they're talking about 100,000. Then there's the cross-border sex workers as well, coming across the border. So the industry is huge. And I'm not talking, I'm just focusing on people who formally recognize sex workers, because there's a whole host of transactional sex where I do a favor and then maybe I get somebody pays for my kid to go to school or something else like that. So transactional sex is huge, and I'm not even talking about transactional sex. It's a reality, it's a survival strategy that many women and in some situations men engaged in Africa. So the industry is very, 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 very huge.
All right, so you've got the Premier of Gauteng saying that she'd welcome decriminalised prostitution. Where does the task force take this debate from here?
Well, we're pleased to be here. We want to thank you guys, and we're actually going to be having different discussion groups on the Law Reform Commission papers. We're going to be having a big one in Cape Town, one in Johannesburg. We're going to be mobilizing sex workers themselves, because it's very important that the voice of sex workers are heard, and that we don't simply treat sex workers as these passive objects, these helpless people who need to be rescued, but actually as active agents, as adults with a voice and who have opinions and hear what they have to say as well. So as sex workers say, nothing about us without us. And I think that's very important, and I think that they need to be involved in those debates. So the idea is to actually go around to different NGOs and get support. And what's very encouraging is a lot of women's rights groups, human rights groups, and other groups and legal groups like the Women's Legal Centre, for example, are coming to the support. Or, for example, organisations like Power are coming to the support of decriminalisation. So it's not just, we're not a lone voice. So there is a partnership movement around voicing the need for decriminalisation.
Well, good luck. You've got one hell of a fight on your hands, Eric. Thank you. Eric Harper from SWET, the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force.